"We don't have a seat for you at the table anymore, Mom," my daughter-in-law said with a smile so polite it almost felt kind, and for a moment, I thought I had misheard her, standing there in the doorway with my coat still on. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon drifting through the house I had once called mine, the same house where I used to host Thanksgiving every single year without fail, where every chair had a place and every place had a name, including mine at the head of the table. But that night, my name was nowhere to be found, not on the polished oak table, not on the folded cream-colored place cards, not even scribbled in the corner as an afterthought, and before I could say anything, before I could even process the quiet shift that had just happened right in front of me, she gestured lightly toward the kitchen, as if pointing out something perfectly reasonable. "We set up a quieter spot for you in there. You'll be more comfortable," she added. And I followed her hand. With my eyes, past the laughter, past the clinking glasses, into the small kitchen where a single metal chair had been placed near the counter. No table setting, no cloth napkin. Just a plate already sitting there like it had been waiting for someone no one expected to matter, and I stood there for a second longer than I should have, long enough to feel the weight of it settle into my chest, long enough to notice that no one at the table had turned to look at me, not my son Daniel, who was carving the turkey like he had done it all his life, not the grandchildren who used to run to hug me the second I walked in, not even the guests, who seemed carefully focused on anything but the woman who no longer had a seat among them. And I realized then that this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a last-minute change or a simple oversight. It was deliberate, planned, quietly executed without confrontation, without explanation. As if erasing me from the table was easier than telling me I no longer belonged there, and still, I didn't say a word. I didn't ask a question. I didn't let my voice break the fragile illusion they had built. I simply walked into the kitchen, placed my purse gently on the counter, and sat down on that cold metal chair, the kind that makes a faint scraping sound against tile, a sound that no one in the other room seemed to hear, and from where I sat, I could see just enough of the dining room through the doorway. Just enough to watch them pass dishes, laugh at stories I had once been part of, raise glasses in a toast I wasn't included in, and I picked up my fork, steady hands, slow breath, as if this were any ordinary meal, as if I hadn't just been moved out of my own life one chair at a time, and somewhere between the first bite and the sound of my daughter-in-law's laughter drifting back to me, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before, that this moment, this quiet relocation to the kitchen, wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the end of something that had been slipping away for years, and they thought I didn't notice. They thought I would accept it the way I had accepted every small change before, every missed call, every holiday shortened, every decision made without me. But as I sat there in that kitchen, alone with my plate and the echo of their voices just out of reach, I realized this would be the last time they decided where I belonged. I stayed there longer than necessary. Even after I had finished eating, my plate empty except for a few crumbs I did not bother to clean, because getting up too soon would have meant acknowledging what they had done. And I was not ready to give them that satisfaction. Not yet, so I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, listening to the rhythm of a dinner that used to revolve around me, the soft rise and fall of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter, the clink of silverware against china. All of it continuing as if nothing had changed, as if I had not been moved out of sight like an extra chair that no longer matched the room, and for a moment, I let myself pretend that I was simply taking a break, that I had chosen this seat, that I had wanted the quiet, but the truth pressed in slowly, steadily, like a draft through a closed window, undeniable and cold, because no one came to check on me. No one asked if I needed anything, not even Daniel, who used to follow me into the kitchen when he was a boy, asking if he could help, asking if he could taste the gravy before it was ready. And I remembered how his small hands used to reach for mine, how he would look up at me like I was the center of his world, and now he could not even look in my direction across a single room, and that was when I understood that this was not just about a chair. It was about distance. Carefully built, layer by layer, over years I had chosen not to question, Years when invitations became shorter, visits became rarer, and conversations became polite instead of warm, and I had told myself it was normal, that families change, that people grow busy, that love simply looks different with time. But sitting there alone, I could finally see the pattern clearly, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Every missed holiday, every last-minute cancellation, every time Ashley had gently suggested that I might be more comfortable staying home, all of it leading here, to this quiet corner where I no longer disrupted their version of family. And I glanced toward the doorway again just as someone walked in, one of the guests. A woman I did not recognize. She paused when she saw me, her expression shifting for just a second, confusion first, then something closer to discomfort, as if she had stepped into a space she was not meant to see. "Oh, I did not realize anyone was in here," she said softly, and I gave her a small smile, the kind that reassures others more than it reveals anything real. "I just needed a quieter place," I replied, the words coming out easily, almost automatically, as if I had been practicing them for years without knowing it, and she hesitated, glancing back toward the dining room, then back at me. "Well, if you would like to join us at the table, I am sure we can make room," she offered, and for a brief second, something inside me stirred, a reflex, a memory of who I used to be, the woman who would have stood up, who would have taken her place without asking permission. But that moment passed as quickly as it came, replaced by a calm I had not expected, a clarity that settled deep and steady. "No," I said gently, shaking my head, "this is fine," and she nodded, though I could tell she did not quite believe me, before stepping back into the other room, leaving the doorway open just enough for me to see them again, Daniel raising his glass, Ashley leaning in close to say something that made him laugh, and I watched them for a long moment, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a kind of quiet understanding that felt heavier than both, because I finally saw them as they were, not as I had hoped them to be, and I realized then that nothing about this evening was accidental, not the missing chair, not the silence, not even the way they had arranged the room so that I would be out of sight, but still close enough to serve a purpose if needed, and that was when the last piece fell into place, not just what they had done, but what they were planning to do next, and for the first time that night I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not for them, but for the decision I had just made. I did not return to the dining room when the plates were cleared, even though I heard chairs shifting and footsteps moving closer, because I already knew how that moment would unfold. A polite glance in my direction, a brief pause, perhaps even a forced invitation that came too late to mean anything at all, and I had no interest in stepping back into a place that had already been taken from me without a word. So instead, I remained where I was, my fingers lightly tracing the edge of the counter, feeling the cool surface beneath my skin as if grounding myself in something real, something that had not been quietly rearranged without my consent. And as the evening continued, I noticed something else, something I had not allowed myself to see before. The way Ashley moved through the room with quiet authority, how she directed small details with a glance or a gentle touch on Daniel's arm, how he responded without question, without hesitation, as if her decisions had long since become his own. And I realized then that this had not happened overnight. It had been built slowly, carefully, over time, each small adjustment so subtle it never seemed worth challenging, until all those small changes formed something permanent, something I was no longer part of, and I let my mind drift back, not to the distant past, but to moments that now felt sharper, clearer, like scenes I was finally seeing without the soft filter of hope. The year Ashley suggested hosting Thanksgiving herself for the first time, her voice warm, her reasoning practical, saying I deserved a break after all those years, and I had smiled, grateful even, not realizing that stepping back once would make it easier to step back again, and then again, until there was nothing left to step back from. And I remembered the following year, when she had rearranged the table settings, explaining that it created better flow for conversation, moving me just slightly off-center, not far, just enough to shift the balance in a way I chose not to question. And then the year after that, when she had introduced a new tradition, assigning seats based on what she called compatibility, pairing people she thought would enjoy each other's company, and I had accepted that too, even when it meant sitting farther away from Daniel. Telling myself it was thoughtful, that it was her way of bringing people together, and now, sitting alone in the kitchen, I could see the pattern with a clarity that felt almost unsettling, not because it was shocking, but because it was so logical, so carefully constructed that it left no room for confrontation, no single moment I could point to and say this is where it went wrong, because nothing had gone wrong all at once. It had simply shifted, quietly, steadily, until I found myself here, in a space that was never meant to be mine, and as I sat there, I heard Ashley's voice again, softer this time, speaking to someone just beyond the doorway, and though I could not see her, I could hear enough to understand. It is just easier this way, she said, a small laugh following. She gets overwhelmed with too much noise, and honestly, this gives us more room, and there it was, not harsh, not cruel, just practical, efficient, spoken as if I were a piece of furniture that had been moved to improve the layout of a room, and I felt something settle inside me then, not anger, not even hurt, but a quiet certainty that I had reached the end of something I had been trying to hold onto for far too long. And for the first time that evening, I straightened slightly in my chair, not out of defiance, but out of recognition, because I understood now that what they had taken from me was not just a seat at the table, it was a role I had already begun to outgrow. Without realizing it, and if they believed that moving me into the kitchen had diminished me, then they had misunderstood something fundamental, not about me, but about what I was capable of doing next. I did not leave when the evening began to wind down, even as coats were gathered and polite goodbyes echoed through the hallway, because I wanted to see how it would end, how far they would carry this quiet rearrangement before acknowledging it out loud. But no one mentioned it, not once, not even when one of the guests stepped into the kitchen to retrieve her purse and offered me a kind but uncertain smile, as if she sensed something was out of place, but did not know how to name it, and I returned the smile with the same practiced calm I had worn all night, the kind that keeps questions from being asked, the kind that makes everything appear just normal enough to avoid discomfort. And when the last car pulled out of the driveway and the house finally settled into that familiar silence, I could hear them in the dining room, Daniel and Ashley, their voices lower now, more relaxed, no longer performing for anyone else, and I stayed where I was. Not hiding, not exactly listening either, just present in a way they had forgotten to account for, and that was when Ashley spoke again, her tone light, almost satisfied. That went better than I expected, she said, and I could picture the way she would be leaning against the table, arms crossed loosely, already reviewing the evening like a completed task, and Daniel responded after a brief pause, his voice quieter than usual. She did not say anything, he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not relief. Exactly. But not concern either, just a simple observation, as if my silence had confirmed something they had already assumed, and Ashley let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Of course she did not, she replied. She never does. And those words lingered longer than anything else that night, not because they were loud or cruel, but because they were true in a way I had never fully acknowledged, and I felt that truth settle into me with a kind of clarity that was impossible to ignore. Because she was right, I had spent years choosing silence, choosing peace, choosing to smooth over discomfort instead of confronting it, believing that patience would preserve something worth keeping, but standing there now, listening to them speak as if I were no longer part of the room, I realized that my silence had not protected anything at all. It had simply made space for them to decide things without me, and Daniel spoke again, more hesitantly this time. "Do you think she noticed?" he asked, and there was a small part of me that almost smiled at that, because even now, after everything, he still did not quite understand me, and Ashley answered without hesitation. "It does not matter if she did," she said, her voice steady, certain. "This is how it has to be going forward. We cannot keep things the way they were," and there it was, not just a moment, not just a single evening, but a plan, something already decided, already set into motion, and I did not need to hear the rest to understand what that meant, because I had lived long enough to recognize when a decision had been made without me, and for the first time, I did not feel the urge to step back into the room and ask for an explanation. I did not feel the need to defend my place or remind them of what I had done for this family, because something had shifted inside me, something quieter but far more solid, and instead of walking toward them, I reached for my coat, slowly, deliberately, slipping it on as if I were preparing for an ordinary departure, and I paused for just a moment at the edge of the kitchen, looking once more at the space where I had spent the evening, the small chair, the empty plate, the faint outline of a place that had never truly been mine, and then I turned toward the front door without making a sound, because I understood now that leaving quietly was not the same as being dismissed. Sometimes it was the first step in choosing something entirely different. I stepped out into the night air without announcing my departure, the door closing behind me with a soft click that felt far louder than it should have, as if it marked something more permanent than the end of a dinner, and for a moment I stood on the front porch, my breath visible in the cool air, my hands resting lightly against the railing I had once helped choose, remembering how Daniel and I had stood in this very spot years ago, debating paint colors and laughing over small details that had once felt so important, and now those memories felt distant, not because they had faded, but because they no longer belonged to the same version of us, and I walked slowly to my car, each step steady, deliberate. Not weighed down by hesitation but guided by something clearer, something I had not allowed myself to feel in a long time, and as I drove home, the quiet inside the car felt different from the silence I had left behind. It was not empty, not hollow, but focused, as if every thought had finally aligned into something I could understand without questioning, and I replayed the evening in my mind, not searching for explanations or excuses, but observing it for what it was, a confirmation. A final piece of evidence that the place I had held in that family no longer existed in the way I had believed it did, and yet, instead of feeling diminished, I felt something else take its place, something steadier, something that did not depend on where I was seated or how I was acknowledged, because for the first time, I was no longer measuring my worth by their actions, and when I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a few seconds longer than necessary, looking at the house in front of me, the one place that had not changed, the one place that still held every decision I had made on my own terms, and I stepped inside, turning on the light, the familiar warmth of the room settling around me, and I moved through it slowly, noticing details I had overlooked before, the photographs on the wall, the quiet order of everything exactly where I had left it, the absence of noise that now felt like clarity rather than loneliness. And I walked into the study, opening the drawer where I kept documents I had not touched in years, papers that once felt too complicated, too unnecessary to revisit, because I had trusted that everything was already understood, already settled. But tonight had shown me otherwise, and I sat down, pulling out the folder with a calm that surprised even me, flipping through pages with careful attention, reading each line as if I were seeing it for the first time, and the more I read, the more certain I became that the decisions ahead of me were not reactions to what had happened, but corrections to something I had allowed to remain unchanged for too long, and I did not rush, I did not let emotion guide me, I simply reviewed, considered, and noted what needed to be done, because the version of me who had sat quietly in that kitchen was not gone. She had simply been waiting for the moment when silence was no longer a shield, but a strategy, and as I closed the folder and placed it carefully back on the desk, I felt a quiet sense of direction settle in, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just clear, and I understood then that whatever they believed they had taken from me that evening had already begun to return in a different form, one that did not require their permission, and for the first time in a very long while, I slept without replaying conversations or questioning my place, because I already knew what I would do next. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, not because I had slept poorly, but because something inside me had already settled into motion, quiet but certain, like a decision that no longer needed to be debated. And the house felt different as I moved through it, not because anything had changed, but because I was finally seeing it without the weight of expectation tied to anyone else. The kitchen counter where I made my coffee, the window where the morning light came in just right, the chair by the table that had always been mine without question, all of it steady, unchanged, untouched by the small shifts that had taken place elsewhere, and I carried my cup into the study, setting it down beside the folder I had opened the night before. The one I had avoided for years out of a sense of trust that now felt misplaced, and I sat down, not hesitating this time, not questioning whether I was overthinking anything, because the clarity from the night before had not faded, it had sharpened. And I began to read. Again, more carefully, more deliberately, taking in every detail with the attention it deserved, and what I saw was not surprising, but it was revealing in a way I could no longer ignore. The ownership of the house, the accounts. The provisions that had once seemed simple, straightforward, based on the assumption that family would always function the way I believed it should, and I realized then that I had left too much open, too much dependent on goodwill and unspoken understanding, things that could shift quietly without ever being addressed, and I reached for a pen, making small notes in the margin, not out of anger, not out of urgency, but out of responsibility, because this was no longer about reacting to what had happened. It was about correcting what I had allowed to remain undefined for too long, and as the morning moved forward, I made a few calls, simple ones, measured, each word chosen with care, not revealing more than necessary, not explaining beyond what was required. Just enough to begin setting things in motion, and I listened as voices on the other end responded with professionalism, with clarity, confirming details, scheduling appointments, treating everything as routine, which in many ways it was, except for the fact that for me, it marked the beginning of something entirely new, and when I hung up the last call, I sat back for a moment, letting the quiet return, not heavy, not uncertain, just present, and I thought about Daniel. About the way he had asked if I noticed, about how easily he had accepted the answer that it did not matter, and I understood then that he had not reached this place overnight either. He had simply adapted to a version of family that no longer included me in the same way, and I did not resent him for that, not in the way I might have before, because resentment would have kept me tied to something that was already slipping away. And I had no intention of holding on to something that no longer existed, and instead, I stood up, closing the folder with a quiet sense of completion, not because everything was finished, but because the direction was clear, and as I moved through the house, I began to see not what I had lost, but what I still had control over, decisions that were mine to make, choices that no longer needed approval or acknowledgement from anyone else, and by the time the afternoon light began to shift across the floor, I had already taken the first steps towards something they had not anticipated, not because it was dramatic, not because it was immediate, but because it was deliberate, and I knew that when the time came, when they realized what had changed, it would not be a surprise to me, it would simply be the result of a decision I had made quietly, long before they ever thought to ask. I did not rush anything in the days that followed, and that was intentional, because I knew that real change did not need to be loud to be effective, it only needed to be steady, and I moved through my routine with the same calm precision I had always carried. Making breakfast, watering the plants, organizing small things around the house that had nothing to do with what I was setting into motion, and yet everything I did now felt different, not because of what I was doing, but because of what I was no longer waiting for, and by the third day the phone call came, just as I expected it would, Daniel's name appearing on the screen at exactly 9:30 in the morning, a time he had chosen carefully, late enough to seem casual, early enough to suggest concern, and I let it ring once more than necessary before answering, not to make a point, but to give myself a moment to listen to the silence on the other end before it was filled with words. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of hesitation and obligation. "I just wanted to check in, you left pretty quickly the other night," and I could almost hear Ashley in the background, not speaking, but present, listening, guiding the direction of the conversation without saying a word, and I responded simply, evenly. I had everything I needed. And there was a pause, brief but noticeable, the kind that comes when someone expects more, expects explanation, expects emotion, and finds none, and he cleared his throat softly. "Ashley thought maybe you were uncomfortable. We just wanted to make sure you were okay." And I allowed myself a small breath before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity. "I was exactly where you placed me, I said, and I let the sentence settle without adding anything else, because it did not need to be explained. It did not need to be softened. It was simply true, and for a moment, there was silence, not awkward, not tense, just revealing, because in that silence, I could feel the shift, the subtle realization that I was no longer responding the way they had expected me to, and Daniel spoke again, more carefully this time. "We were just trying to make things easier," he said, repeating words that no longer held the meaning they once did, and I did not challenge him, I did not argue. Because this was not a conversation I needed to win, it was a pattern I had already stepped out of, and instead, I changed the direction gently. "I have been reviewing some things here," I said, my tone steady, neutral. "There are a few updates I will be making in the next couple of weeks," and I could feel his attention sharpen instantly, the shift in his breathing, the way uncertainty entered where there had once been assumption. "What kind of updates?" he asked, and I allowed a small pause, not to create tension, but because I was choosing my words with care, the kind that should have been made a long time ago, I replied, and I did not elaborate further, because details were no longer something I needed to share before they were finalized. And there was another pause, longer this time, heavier, and I knew without hearing it that Ashley was now fully focused on every word, and Daniel's voice came back slightly tighter. "Mom, is everything all right?" And I smiled, not out of humor, but out of recognition, because this was the first real question he had asked that mattered, and I answered it honestly. "Yes," I said, "everything is exactly as it should be," and I ended the call shortly after. Not abruptly, but with the same calm finality that had guided every decision I had made since that evening, and as I set the phone down, I felt no rush, no surge of emotion, just a quiet confirmation that the shift had begun, not in their house, not at their table, but here, in the space where I had finally chosen to decide things for myself, and I knew then that whatever came next would not be something they arranged without me. It would be something I had already set in place long before they realized the seat they had taken from me was never the one that truly mattered. I did not wait for them to call again, and that was the difference this time, because before, I would have measured my next step based on their response, their tone, their approval, but now I moved forward without needing any of that, and by the end of the week, I sat across from a man who had known me for over 20 years. Someone who did not need long explanations or emotional context to understand what I was doing, because everything was written clearly in front of him, every document, every decision, every adjustment I had begun to put into place, and he reviewed them carefully, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet respect, as if he had been waiting for this moment longer than I had, and when he finally looked up, he did not ask why, he simply asked, "Are you certain?" And I answered without hesitation, "I should have done this years ago," and that was all that needed to be said, because certainty does not require justification when it is built on truth, and over the next hour, we finalized what had been left open for far too long, details that once felt unnecessary to define now taking clear, precise form, ownership clarified, control secured. Boundaries established in a way that could not be quietly shifted or reinterpreted by anyone else, and when I signed the final page, I did not feel dramatic, I did not feel victorious, I felt steady, as if something that had been out of alignment for years had finally settled into place, and as I left the office, the air felt lighter, not because anything outside had changed, but because something inside me had. And later that afternoon, I received another call, this time from Ashley, which was something she had never done before without Daniel present, and I let it ring twice before answering, her voice carefully composed, polite, measured. "Margaret, I just wanted to check in. Daniel mentioned you were making some updates, and I thought it might be helpful if we all discuss things together." And I listened without interrupting, without reacting, because I recognized the shift in her approach. The attempt to bring me back into a structure where decisions could be influenced, adjusted, softened, and I responded simply, "There is nothing that needs to be discussed," and there was a pause, longer than the one Daniel had given me, and when she spoke again, her tone had changed slightly, still controlled, but more direct. "We are just trying to understand how this affects everyone," she said, and I allowed myself a small breath before answering, choosing clarity over comfort. "It affects exactly what belongs to me," I said, and I let the words rest there, not expanding, not explaining, because they did not need to be negotiated, and for the first time, I could hear something in her silence, not confusion. Not even frustration, but a recognition that the space she had been managing so carefully was no longer hers to arrange, and when the call ended, I set the phone down without a second thought, because the outcome of that conversation had already been decided long before she made it. And that evening, I returned to the same chair by my window, the one that had always been mine, watching the light fade slowly across the yard, and I realized then that the most significant part of everything that had happened was not the dinner, not the kitchen, not even the quiet conversation that followed. It was the moment I stopped waiting to be placed somewhere and chose instead to decide exactly where I stood, and from that point on, there was nothing left for them to rearrange. They did not come to my house right away, and that told me more than anything they could have said, because hesitation is not about confusion, it is about recalculating, and I knew they were trying to understand what had changed without asking directly. Trying to measure what they could still influence and what had already moved beyond their reach, and I let that space remain exactly as it was, undisturbed, because I had no reason to fill it anymore, and it was not until the following Sunday that Daniel finally stood at my front door, alone this time, his posture slightly uncertain as I opened it, as if he was not entirely sure which version of me he would be greeted by, and I stepped aside without a word, allowing him in the same way I always had, calm, composed, unchanged in the ways that mattered, and he looked around briefly, taking in the familiar space, as if seeing it differently now, as if something about it no longer felt guaranteed. And we sat across from each other in the living room, not at the dining table, not in the kitchen, but in a space that had always been neutral, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, not out of discomfort, but because the conversation he had come for did not fit easily into simple words. And when he finally began, his voice carried a careful tone. "Mom, I think we need to talk about what is happening," and I nodded slightly, not inviting, not resisting, simply acknowledging, and he continued, choosing his words with more care than I had ever heard from him before. "Ashley feels like things are changing very quickly, and we just want to make sure everyone is on the same page," and I listened without interruption, because I recognized the language, the structure of it, the way responsibility was being shared in a sentence that did not quite belong to him alone, and when he finished, I allowed a brief pause before answering, not to create tension, but to ensure that what I said was not reactive. "Things are not changing quickly," I said, my voice even, steady. "They have already changed," and he looked at me then, more directly than he had in a long time, and I could see it, the moment he realized that this was not a misunderstanding to be corrected, not a situation to be smoothed over, but a reality that had already settled into place without his approval, and he shifted slightly in his seat. "We did not mean for you to feel pushed out," he said, and I almost smiled at that, not because it was humorous, but because it was incomplete, because intention does not erase outcome, and I answered simply, "You did not need to mean it," and I let that truth stand on its own, without accusation, without emotion, just fact, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to show that he understood more than he wanted to admit, and for the first time, there was no attempt to redirect the conversation. No effort to soften what had already been done, just a quiet acceptance that something fundamental had shifted between us, and I did not ask him to fix it. I did not offer him a way to return things to how they were, because I no longer needed that version of our relationship to exist, and instead, I stood up slowly, moving to the window for a moment, looking out at the yard that had not changed, the same trees, the same path, the same space where I had spent years building something I thought would always remain the same. And when I turned back to him, my voice remained calm, not distant, not cold, just clear. "I am not asking for a seat at your table anymore," I said, and I watched as the meaning of those words settled into him, deeper than anything else I had said, because it was not a request, it was a decision, And I continued, I have my own, and there was nothing left to add after that, no explanation, no justification, just the quiet certainty of a boundary that had already been drawn. And as he sat there, taking in what I had said, I knew that whatever came next would not be something I waited for. It would simply be something I allowed, on my terms, in my space, exactly where I had chosen to stand.